I'm really pleased to welcome our first speaker, Sheila Jeffreys. She's from the UK and Australia. She's a radical lesbian, feminist author and activist. And the title of the talk is The Sexual Harassment of Transgenderism in the Workplace. So over to you, Sheila.
The talk that I'm going to give today concerns the way that women experience the fetishistic behavior of men who do what they call their gender expression in the workplace. It consists of the submission I made to a call for evidence by the UN Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Reem Al-Salim, on what she calls sex-based violence against women and girls. I am actually delighted, of course, that this term, sex-based violence, sex-based generally, is now being used instead of the dreadful term gender violence, which has been used generally in recent years and has been actually sort of unintelligible. Genders are not violence to each other, and gender can't be violent. So yes, so this is a submission to a call for evidence on sex-based violence against women and girls. In the call for evidence, Reem Al-Salim asks several questions that we are invited to respond to. So the one that I chose to respond to was something called Key Question 3, and it says, are there emerging forms or evolving dynamics of sex-based violence against women and girls that call for a deeper and more nuanced understanding of such sex-based forms of violence? The emerging form that I'm addressing here is the sex-based sexual harassment of women in the workplace that is caused by the expression of gender identity or other forms of fetishistic behavior by men. This is new, and I'm going to talk about it. And I'm interested in making sure that we all have a language to address this because it's becoming a more and more important problem. So I thought that the definition of sexual harassment I should use is from the UN, and it's the United Nations System Model Policy on Sexual Harassment. And I think it fits very well with what I'm going to say about men's gender expression. So it says, sexual harassment is any unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature that results in physical, psychological, or sexual harm that might reasonably be expected or be perceived to cause offence or humiliation when such conduct interferes with work, is made a condition of employment, or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. And it adds, in assessing the reasonableness of expectations or perceptions, the perspective of the person who is the target of the conduct shall be considered. Well, women are the targets of the conduct, so it is important that we are able to speak about this. And as I go through, I'll show how this behavior by men fits with all these different aspects of the United Nations System Model Policy on sexual harassment. First of all, I'm going to talk about the form of sexual harassment that is men's gender expression emerged, because it's really becoming quite obvious now. So I'm going to do a bit of the history of transvestism here, which I know most of you know very well, so forgive me for the repetition. But I needed to do this for the submission because this history may not be known, and we know it is not known to some in UN circles. So I had to introduce this. So until the last 2 decades, men with an interest in pretending to be women have been classified by sexologists, the sexologists of sex, as transvestites. Transvestism has been understood as a form of sexual fetishism, in which men gain masochistic sexual excitement from adopting what they see as the behavior of the subordinate class of women. This behavior in earlier decades is likely to have been carried out in secluded locations, bathrooms in front of the mirror, hotel rooms, specialized weekends away, specialized clubs. There was not sufficient social acceptance for these men to engage in their fetish behavior in public and in the workplace. In recent decades, however, there's been a movement to reshape the popular and scientific understanding of transvestism, to erase the knowledge that it is a sexual paraphilia. In its place, the idea has been promoted that the men who do this are a special kind of person in possession of a female brain sex that makes them into women. Many sexologists have changed their mind and taken up the new ideology, or at least not questioned it. The sexologists who have not changed their understanding of the behavior, however, and continue to understand it as sexual, have changed their terminology and are now more likely to call transvestism autogynephilia, which is the love of the woman in themselves. In the age of the internet, the pornography, the very numerous websites, the burgeoning industry and support groups that promote and create this paraphilia have greatly increased in volume. The men with this paraphilia began to campaign in the 1990s to be seen as an excluded minority group with a right to express what they called their gender identity, which I now argue is causing huge problems in the form of sexual harassment in the workplace. Their campaigning work resulted in their practice now being generally seen as requiring respect and protection in public places, including legislatures, women's sports, workplaces. The sexual satisfaction they once gained from what was called being dressed in front of the bathroom mirror or in a fetish club can now be gained from dressing up in front of and gaining affirmation from women in many environments. The workplace is one of the stages on which the fetish behavior can now be acted out. Women co-workers have become the unwilling participants in the men's sexual fantasy. Though women are sexually harassed in a variety of venues by men, both with and without gender identities, I'm concentrating on the workplace here because discrimination against women in the workplace and the destruction of women's rights at work are well recognized in law and policy as serious obstacles to women's equality. Also, workplace sexual harassment usually offers remedies that other forms of harassment do not. Unfortunately, the new form of sexual harassment that I'm addressing here, that carried out by men who are expressing their gender, is not yet included in what is understood to be sexual harassment at work. And that's what I want to have happen. I want this form of harassment to be included. Now, the form of men's behavior, this form of men's behavior fits into the UN Women's definition of sexual harassment because it is overwhelmingly, quote, unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature, which men now practice in the workplace to women's detriment. And it causes, quote, physical, psychological, and sexual harm, and offense or humiliation. There are three forms of this variety of sexual harassment that I will examine here. The first is of that of men expressing their gender in places within workplaces that have traditionally been single-sex in order to protect women's dignity and privacy, such as bathrooms and change rooms. The second is that of women workers such as police officers or prison officers, having to treat men with gender identities as if they are women, as in being required to strip search male offenders or prisoners. The third is that of women workers being required to work alongside and affirm male co-workers who decide to express their gender identity in the workplace. For instance, simply being required to sit next to a man who is in a position to require that the woman call him special names and flaunt his sexual fetish in front of her while she is working. Now, I'm going to look at the form that is first in my list. In the UK, there have been two notable cases of the first form, where female nurses have made complaints to their employers over having to share intimate spaces with these men. In one case in March 2024, 8 nurses in County Durham in the UK complained to their employer that a man who had not transitioned and looked very male was accessing the space in which the nurses had to change out of their scrubs twice a day. Senior hospital employees told the nurses that they needed to be re-educated. On receiving no support, they went on to sue the hospital trust in June 2024 for sexual harassment and sex discrimination because of the policy which allowed these men to use their women's changing rooms. This case has not yet come to court or been decided. Now, then there was another case, a similar case in Scotland. A nurse took her employers to an employment tribunal because she was forced to share a change room with a male doctor. Her employers told her that she could change in a cupboard. The tribunal for this nurse, Sandra Peggy, has been taking place in the last couple of weeks. So we have quite a lot of information and it's really been in the news. Here we have the two persons in this tribunal. We've got Sandy Peggy, who is the nurse, and Beth Upton is the man who is the male doctor. The case of Sandy Peggy has gripped Scotland. Peggy is a nurse who had worked for 30 years for the NHS Scotland when the male doctor, who calls himself Beth Upton, decided to pretend to be a woman and use the women's changing room. Upton did not have a gender recognition certificate. He was just a man who decided to imitate a woman without even the fig leaf of legitimacy that the ridiculous Gender Recognition Act could provide. Peggy found it disturbing to have to share a changing room with a man. On 2 occasions, she simply left when she found him there. And this annoyed him because, of course, the point for him was being able to embarrass and distress a woman. On another occasion on which she was having a flooding period, which happens quite commonly to women going through the menopause, and was afraid she had bled through her scrubs, she tried to use the changing room. On finding Upton in occupation, she told him he should not be there. Shortly after this, Upton made a formal complaint against Peggy that she had engaged in an act of harassment constitutive of a hate incident. She was suspended on the grounds that he had the right to use the women's change room. In fact, that is not the case. And it was the legal responsibility of the hospital to provide changing rooms separated by sex. She sued Upton and the NH board for several claims of harassment and discrimination. And for the last 2 weeks, the tribunal, as I say, has been taking place. It should be over by now as a result of some withholding of evidence and the need to call more witnesses. However, it has been delayed and has to reconvene in July. So she has the punishment of having to suffer this harassment and hostile behavior towards her, of having to be in the courtroom for several more months. Now, Peggy has become a hero to many women, and when she went into court on her most recent appearance, she was piped in, i.e. a piper played his traditional Scottish instrument to celebrate her entrance. Her case is so clearly unfair that it's caused some politicians who had been previously complicit to come out and denounce what is being done to her. There seems little doubt that she will win, but she's already been punished by having to undergo the ordeal. In the last week of the tribunal, she found that Dr. Upton and her employers intended to continue their pursuit of her. NHS Fife scheduled a conduct hearing to examine allegations against her of misconduct, failures of patient care, and misgendering, which could lead to her dismissal. And this hearing as well has been postponed. But the bullying doesn't end there. It goes on and on, really. A group set up to support the doctor has reported the Scottish Daily Express, a newspaper which was brave enough to describe him as a man, throughout the tribunal, to the police for targeted harassment in the form of misgendering. So the newspapers are apparently not allowed, I think they will win actually, but not allowed to say that a man is a man, even in a situation like this. More has come out in the last couple of days, which is that it has been discovered that the NHS in the UK allows a male doctor who decides he wants to play at being a woman for a while to change his name and his NHS number so that on all official records he becomes a completely new person. And Beth Upton did this in 2023. So it's not possible for patients or anybody to look up a man's record and work out who he is and what he has done in the past. And there's now, I think this will change because there's considerable discomfort about the fact that a man is able to do that. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the second type of sexual harassment, which concerns women workers being required to engage in intimate touching of a man's body under the pretense that he is really a woman because he has a gender identity. In early 2023, female prison officers working at a men's prison in Scotland, who had to strip search male prisoners, complained after they were ordered to carry out this procedure on a very violent man who had a gender identity and intact genitalia. The requirement to strip search men with gender identities was later repealed. The same problem arises in relation to female prison officers being required to search male prisoners with gender identities. And I'm sure we will find that in many other situations, this problem of forcing women to touch men intimately takes place. Now, the third kind of sexual harassment that men with gender identities introduce into the workplace is simply their presence, which is extremely unwelcome for many women. In the case of a similar behavior, now most usually called blackface, in which white people black up and mock black people, the behavior has become socially unacceptable. It's now seen as racist and as insulting to persons from ethnic minorities, and it would not be acceptable in the workplace. But of course, that realization has not arrived yet in relation to pretending to be women. The expression of gender identities by men, however, is not seen as acceptable, is not only seen as acceptable in the workplace, but the welcoming of it is very generally imposed upon other workers by workplace codes of practice. Women workers are required to welcome behavior in which men are sexually excited by imitating what they see as the expression of their internal feminine gender. The transvestites are likely to have their excitement enhanced by getting co-workers rather, to affirm them through use of their female names and pronouns, and even by discussion of what they see as their femaleness. They might, for instance, wish to discuss menstruation. This happens. These men do like to discuss menstruation with women and pretend that menstruation is something that they do. And that is obviously, very obviously, a sexual harassment. These men may imitate women's biology, and that's a very significant part, in fact, of autogynephilia. This may cause women distress and discomfort because from the men's behavior, such that it should definitely be included in the definition of sexual harassment. However, the women may not only be unable to complain about the behavior, but may be required by workplace policies to be welcoming of it. Now, alongside the increase in men's interest in transvestism, there's been an increase in men's interest in other forms of paraphilia and fetish behavior. And it is now starting to happen that men want to engage in these forms of behavior in the workplace too. Men with a paraphilia are likely to have more than one. Men with gender identities, for instance, may also have the paraphilia of age regression, in which they imitate female babies or schoolgirls. So they may wish to come to work as a schoolgirl. None have done this exactly yet. But as we shall see, they do want to wear nappies. All forms of men's fetishism now have extensive niches in the pornography industry and in support communities on the internet. Forms of behavior that were once known about only from obscure articles in sexology journals are now being increasingly practiced in public, including in the workplace. And over the last decade, male fetishes have gained confidence about expressing their fetish identities in the workplace. They've been able to organize through their online meetup groups about how to express themselves in public. The fetish behavior that is best known is that of pretending to be women, and that's gained great acceptability. But other more unusual fetishes are now intruding into public spaces, including the workplace. For instance, male naturists get sexual excitement from two perversions: indecent exposure, showing their penises to women and girls, and scopophilia, getting excited by seeing women and girls naked. And they have difficulty getting women to join their organizations or take part in their practice because, of course, women don't have those perversions. But they are coming out into the public world increasingly in the last few years and creating problems for women in the workplace. As far back as 2017, the Sydney Dance Company in Australia had 3 nude nights when the performers and the audience were nude. Presumably there were women working there. More recently, museums like Dorchester Museum in the UK in 2024 and art galleries are increasingly holding nudist nights. In terms of sexual harassment, the female staff are likely to be affected by all of this, either having to be naked to get the work or to act as an audience for the men's fetish behavior. Now, I want to talk in more detail about the men's fetish, which is nappy fetishism. In December 2023, in a children's play space in Lancing in Sussex, which is a coastal town just near where I live, there was a night for nappy fetishists. And this is a description of it in the media. A mum is horrified after discovering that a soft play area used by her kids has been taken over by adults dressed as babies for parties. The woman came across an advert on the Fet Life, that is Fetish Life website, for events at the Wild Wonderland Indoor Play Centre in Lancing, West Sussex. One recent meetup was open to age players, so it could be men, could pretend to be little girls. So littles, I don't know what so littles are, and I haven't looked them up. Middles, these are presumably different age ranges they imitate. Carers, so they can bring along their wives who are persuaded to prepare for them. So sometimes wives have to change nappies, for instance. Mummies, daddies, siblings, furries, kittens, puppies, their handlers, and any wet-only adult baby diaper lover. I presume this means that only diaper lovers who may pee into the diapers are acceptable. They shouldn't be intending to shit into the diapers, although very often in very many places they do. So nappy or diaper fetishism support groups contain much discussion of how these men choose to express their perversion in the workplace. Wearing nappies to work and soiling them in the workplace are common themes on the websites of nappy fetishist communities. There have also been several reports in the media of men pretending to be female babies, demanding that female workers, carers, for instance, university lecturers, psychiatrists, affirm their fetish or change their soiled nappies in the workplace. This is a young man from West Virginia who was covered in the British media because he found himself unemployed as a result of his nappy fetishism. He said, acting like a baby gives off a very calm, relaxing and safe vibe, but his lifestyle has caused problems in his professional life. Currently unemployed, he is constantly in and out of jobs and has been fired by previous employers for being childish. Speaking to Metro UK, Damien said, diapers are very convenient, comfortable and cute. It's a very nice lifestyle and I wouldn't want to do anything else. There we are. There is Damien showing how he likes to be. And of course, he wants to be able to do this in the workplace. Presumably, he'd wear a pair of trousers. But what happens with nappy fetishes is they tend to show the back of the nappy just over the top of the trousers so that everybody's aware of what they're doing when they're in the workplace. There are plentiful resources online for men who see themselves as part of the adult baby community, which discuss the delights and problems of wearing nappies in the workplace. Adrian Surley, for instance, is a nappy fetishist whose detailed blog and discussion page is online. Adrian says, I can absolutely guarantee you that 80% of people who tried on an adult nappy would enjoy the feeling or not mind it. Obviously, it would take an adjustment period. But in the end, I can almost guarantee you that 80% at least of people would enjoy it and feel a certain level of comfort and security in them, amongst other things. So on Adrian Surley's page, men discuss questions such as whether they only pee in their nappies at work, or whether they're bold enough to poo, in which case they have to take equipment with them to clean themselves up, and so on. On other pages, men discuss problems such as how to make themselves pee, because it's quite difficult for men to overcome nappy training and make themselves pee on demand. So that's something that where they share insights with each other. Other men talk about the problem of having sensitive skin, which is allergic to disposable nappies, and so on and so on. Now, fetish behaviors in general by men should be understood as sort of fitting into the definition of sexual harassment. They are unwelcome, they cause a hostile or offensive work environment. And I have got a great deal of information and examples of the ways in which men's sexual perversions are being enabled in public places and venues, but I don't have time to talk about them all today. Now, this old chap is a civil servant. I think he was at the Home Office. So in the UK, this problem of fetish at work was illustrated by the behavior of the male civil servant with a gender identity. He's already got a gender identity, who some of his colleagues argued chose to practice his interest in BDSM through the clothing he wore at work. He had, as is so often, multiple paraphilias. You know, he's described in this case in the fetish costume as wearing fetish gear consisting of fishnet tights, low-cut corsets, and chokers. But the fact that he's dressing as a woman is not significant because, you know, that's acceptable. That's seen as something which is perfectly okay. It's the fact that he went into what they called BDSM costume that is the problem. And in fact, Baroness Jenkins asked a question about this in the House of Lords. It's received a bit of attention that he was not just dressing up as a woman, ordinary fetish behavior, but going beyond that and doing BDSM. Now I want to talk about the pressure being put on women to welcome men's gender expression, or fetish expression, what one might call it, in the workplace. Presently, it is only cross-dressing fetishism that is acceptable at work, where it's supported with policies and practices. At present, there's no protection for nudists or nappy fetishists, but nothing would surprise me, since these men are getting more and more privileges to do their sexual expression to or at women and girls in public places and cultural venues. Now, the UN System Policy on Sexual Harassment that we looked at earlier defines sexual harassment as behaviours which interfere with work, is made a condition of employment, or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. Increasingly, though, affirmation of the behaviour of men who express their gender identity through being welcoming and using the men's preferred sexual pronouns and names is being imposed on women by workplace codes of conduct and education and training. It's now become, I would argue, and this is part of the definition, a condition of employment in many workplaces. So women have to accept this sexual harassment. It's a condition of employment. There's an increasing academic literature on the importance of workplace policies on gender identity. That is, workplaces must always all have these policies. And they may enforce a duty on all employees to positively welcome men's gender expression. The literature argues, for instance, that men who express their female gender identity suffer minority stress, which co-workers must reduce through their affirming conduct. Failure to welcome is referred to as microaggression. We've all heard of them, haven't we? This is very naughty behavior on the part of women. So if women don't affirm, if they're not enthusiastic, this is microaggression. Even when there are TGD workplace protections available, microaggressions still occur in points not clearly outlined in the policies. Co-workers should be educated to support the men and perform acts of oppositional courage. So the women co-workers must be courageous in supporting these men and certainly not do microaggression. The research articles on how men are who are expressing their gender in the workplace feel and what should be done to help them do sometimes comment on the fact that there's no research on how anyone else in the workplace feels, particularly women, of course. It's significant that the UN definition of sexual harassment states, in assessing the reasonableness of expectations or perceptions, the perspective of the person who is the target of the conduct shall be considered. Women are not considered. They are forced with all kinds of penalties, as we have seen earlier in this talk. Because, of course, Sandy Peggy did not affirm. She did do microaggression. This is one of these articles about what has to happen in the workplace. It states that this is on non-binary workers, because presumably co-workers got to respect non-binary workers as well. Of course, there's no such thing as men who become women. It states that there are various ways non-binary workers express their gender identity at work via physical appearance and clothing, gestures and language, posture and movement, and other communication signals. So presumably women in the workplace should be looking out for the signals so that they can affirm and not do microaggressions and behave in all the ways that they're supposed to. The Human Rights Campaign, which is an organization which is influential in the promotion of gender identity rights, created an online resource in 2016 on gender identity rights in the workplace. The man who's the main speaker in the video says, gender identity rights must allow a man such as himself with an incipient beard and lipstick to go to work in one gender one day and a different gender the next. Now, this is exhausting for women co-workers to be having to constantly affirm one day after the next men in different genders is obviously a significant problem for women in the workplace. Workplace management adopt policies to welcome men who imitate women into the workplace as a result of the volume of campaigning effort by organizations that promote what they call gender identity rights, and because they wish to avoid experiencing penalties imposed by legislation that now enshrines these rights in law. As a result, the rights of women workers to dignity and respect in the workplace suffer. Until recently, women workers had been making considerable progress in fighting for their rights at work, including freedom from sexual harassment. Now, the workplace for increasing numbers of women has become a toxic environment in which they must show affirmation towards men expressing the sexual paraphilia of transvestism or face penalties. Where this happens, the workplace becomes once again discriminatory against women in order that some men may use it as a play space for the expression of their sexual excitement. The protection of women's rights in the workplace requires the adoption of a definition of sexual harassment which includes the expression of gender identity and other forms, all forms of fetishistic behavior by men. Thank you.